Hello, hello. I was invited to come and do a breakout over lunch. I was never told I was going to be a keynote, so Kim's been putting pressure on me all day. First of all, I want to thank everybody in the room. It's a thrill for us, for MMGY, to be representing this destination. I think we have 10 or 12 people here this week with you. We're here a lot. The success is thrilling, but more than that, it's just been a joy to work in this community with the passion of the people and the product, and it's just really great. So I want to thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, maybe we'll crack some mysteries today, but I always like to start with a test. And Fran, you cannot answer this question. Hopefully people in the room know who this is. Probably the greatest hitter in baseball history. It's appropriate to have a Red Sox player up there because of the legacy here in Fort Myers. Ted Williams, who was the last man to bat over 400 for a season, is a legendary athlete. And he was legendary because he had eyesight that was apparently better than everybody else's. And I'll tell you why I'm telling you this story in just a second. He was at Fenway one day taking batting practice, and he looked down at the plate, and he told his buddies and players that were around him that the plate was crooked. And his buddies looked down at it and said, "Ted, you're crazy. The plate's not crooked. We're at Fenway Park." And Ted looked back down at it and he said, "I'm telling you, it's crooked. I want the greenskeeper out here right now to measure it." So the greenskeeper comes out and finds out that it's actually off by a quarter inch. A quarter inch. This was Ted Williams with the legendary eyesight. So, this is sort of the moral of this story. A quarter inch doesn't seem like much, right? But Ted Williams did a lot of his damage at Fenway down the left field line. He went the other way. It was a lefty that went the other way a lot. If you took a quarter inch down the entire left field line, it was 12 feet of fair territory. And it just gives you a sense of how dialed in he was to what he was doing. For me, the analogy is the kind of information I'm going to share with you today, if you think about it in the short term, maybe has that quarter of an inch of an aperture, but if you think about it over the longer term, I actually think it's more valuable. And I think that goes for a lot of the things that were probably shared today, that if you think about it in the macro, it's often more valuable. So as I'm sharing this with you, it's going to be fluid. I'm happy to have you challenge it at the end because we'll have some time for Q&A, but I also want you to think about it in the terms of sort of the macro. And that leads into this point. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said that there's nothing more deceptive than obvious fact. And I think you'll see as we go through the discussion today that may actually be true. So let's do three things. Let me talk to you a little bit about what we see the road ahead for travel, how I think you make the right connections to that change, and then what are some of the marketing considerations that maybe we as a community want to think about and that we're certainly thinking about for the beaches of Fort Myers and Sanibel. So first, the road ahead. Even today, right now, people are still asking the question, is the sun rising or is it setting on the travel space? Are we still growing, or are we going to hit some troubled waters, and are we actually now kind of at the top of the market? And is the sun going to begin to set? And I'll come back to that in just a second. We have been doing for this community as well as for the travel industry at large a study called Travel Horizons, which looks at travel sentiment, trip demand in the future. And we do waves every quarter to look at what we think demand will be going forward. And this is what I'm going to share with you first, that we believe the sun is still rising. So that was Matanzas, is that how I say it, Tam? That photo was the mooring out there. The sun is rising. And we believe there is a brighter horizon line for the travel community, and most especially for this community. One of the things we poll is how people feel about themselves and about the economy. A year ago, just over a year ago, 58% of the people we polled said that they still feel like there's a recession, even though they've been told it's over. That number is now 53%, which is a marked improvement, but at the same time, it tells you a lot of people still don't feel like they're whole yet, that the economy is rewarding them at the moment, and that's important to understand. Travelers, by and large, are represented by households that have at least $50,000 of household income. If you go below that income level, the incidence of travel is much smaller. So our sample size focuses on people with at least household income of $50,000, and that response is people with household incomes of at least $50,000. So we're not polling people who are at the very lowest part of our economy. And there's still a fair amount of cynicism there, or consumer anxiety. I think it's important to understand. When we polled the question, will you travel next year for leisure? In 2013, 5 in 10, or just over 5 in 10 people said they would. In this last wave, 6 in 10. At the net level, it was about 0.7% increase. So it's an increase. More people are wanting to travel. And for the first time in our polling, we've done this study for over 20 years, more people said they're going to travel more than people said they're going to travel less. And this is very recent data. So this is a good sign in terms of demand generators, that people are planning to do more trips and they're planning to do fewer trips, and those that aren't are at about the same. You can see a few are not sure. But this is what Tam alluded to this morning when she kicked off the session around TSI, Traveler Sentiment Index. Lee County's is actually higher than the average. I believe it's 112 for our community right now. It hit its peak in our index for all of travel at 108, which, as you can see, this graph goes all the way back to March of 2007. So essentially over 7 years, we've finally gotten back to that level over a period of time. And I want to point this out, and this is really important. I've been saying to people, some of the people in this room, that I thought this community was slow to raise rates in a growing demand environment. And I think I've said at several TDC meetings that I was encouraging the hotel community especially to begin to raise rates because we saw demand generators growing for some time. But what this graph tells you is something pretty marked in my opinion. If you go back to the first arrow on the left in February of 2009, you will see, and by the way, these two graphs, one is our TSI, our Travel Sentiment Index, the other is consumer confidence as measured by the University of Michigan. By and large, they're in lockstep. But if you go back to February of 2009, you'll see there was a divergence point. We actually saw the lower line, consumer confidence, go down while trip sentiment and intent to travel went up. Anybody want to suggest why? This is at the point when rates started going to the floor. So we had a weak travel environment. The industry, especially air and hotel, decided to lower rates, and it actually drove increased demand. It's one of those countercyclical points where we saw travel outpace general consumer confidence. I would argue today that we're at exactly the opposite point. If you go all the way out to the right, and you see just in the last quarter, we're seeing a decline in trip intent, in confidence to travel, while consumer confidence is still rising. My contention is that rates, especially airfares, are beginning to outpace demand. And because we've reached a compression point, especially with the airlines, we're going to see cost to travel go up, and we're going to see intent to travel go down, especially in specific communities that travel. And I'm going to get into some of that detail in a minute. This is a broad look at the industry. This is not for this community. I would still be of the opinion, based on what I've seen, that there's room to grow right here. But I do not think that's the case across all travel in the United States. And that's supported by this data. So at the end of the day, what it says to me is that suppliers have all the power right now, and especially air and hotel partners. We know that a lot of us in the room benefit when fares are low or hotel rates are low. We're not all hoteliers and we don't all own airlines. So when costs are lower to get to a destination, those of us in a destination stand a lot to gain, right? As fares and hotel rates go up, disposable income for at destination goes down, and we can see very often a curve against other kinds of spend in a community when those other costs are going up. And the suppliers have a lot of control right now in terms of rate. And we see that even if you look into next year, what most hotel communities are saying about rates is that they will go higher again. So my macro take in terms of the broader market is this. We still see very good traveler sentiment. It's positive going forward. It's come down slightly in the last quarter. I think if pricing stabilizes and we don't see continued huge growth in rates and fares, then we'll still see demand growth. Second thing I would say is that because there is so much more demand, it's translated into pricing power, as I pointed out, for suppliers. And then the core markets are still very strong. And the nice thing is we're seeing long-haul destination travel reemerge as a powerful force. We went through a long period of time where frequency was up, but length of stay and length of trip was down. The long-haul patterns, inter-US, long-haul intra-US, are actually now coming back a little bit, which is good. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So who's driving the market? This is a look at demand going forward by region of the United States. This, by and large, is good news for us. One, we're growing the Midwest market. Tam and Pam showcased that a little bit earlier, where we talked about Detroit moving into our priorities. We've been focusing on Minneapolis, Indianapolis, Columbus. Those are all good markets for us, and the Midwest is showing good growth for trip demand. The West is the one taking it on the chin right now. I've asked our research team why, and they haven't given me a good answer yet. But the good news is the Midwest and the Northeast are still trending up in terms of demand, and that's good for us here. This might not be so good for Hawaii, the greater West, potentially Asia, intra-US, but that remains to be seen. The affluent market is still leading the recovery in travel. So this is a look at expected trips this year versus last year, and it's done by household income. So there are two interesting things here. One that's pretty intuitive. People who have more money are going to travel more. We see a lot of people who are even in the marginal luxury space trying to move up market to attract that crowd because they're the ones with more disposable income and in some cases more disposable time. But I think the thing that's not so intuitive is the far left there on the household incomes. You see that household incomes of $50,000 to $125,000 or $124,000 actually is saying that they're going to take fewer trips at a higher rate than they have in the past. I actually think that's misleading because what I said earlier is true. That demographic in particular has historically taken a lot of trips shorter distance over the last 7 or 8 years. And what they're telling us now is I'm ready to take longer trips, but fewer of them. So I actually think for long-haul destinations, this isn't bad news. This might be bad news if you're a regional theme park or if you're very heavily a drive destination. I think if you're relying on local weekend business, this might be a bad thing because we see a pattern of long-haul travel beginning to reemerge in this country. I was going to use this to talk about sort of the generations, and I thought it was kind of cool with the Florida state, but then I thought it really looks more like Pac-Man eating a lima bean, so I decided to use this instead. Don't you agree that's pretty ugly? It's cool that it's got Florida in the middle, though. So let's use a bowling alley analogy instead. And this is important to take away, I think. Everybody wants to talk about millennials, and I'll tell you why they want to. But there's also this market called the boomers, right? And then in between you have the Gen X. What's important to understand is that Gen X is really, if you look at the research, even not our research, consumer research, part of Gen X really identifies more with millennials, and part of Gen X is identifying more with boomers. And so by marketing to both millennials and boomers, you're going to benefit from some volume from Gen Xers, and I'm going to get into some of that in just a minute. Tam also shared these numbers this morning that were, not quite a third when you look at millennials, Gen Xers, and boomers, but it's a fair share of the market. All three audiences are important to us, the point I want to make here. But let's contrast millennials to boomers. Let's just talk about that for a minute, right? I think you can figure out which is which here, right? How many in the room are Gen Xers? Right? Bad news, we're a pessimistic, angry group. This is research. This is actually polling how you feel about the future, your family, your job, and your life in general. Millennials are by far the most optimistic, and Gen Xers just must hate life, right? And this is real data, and I'm going to talk about why this is important in terms of travel in just a second. But millennials are really driving demand right now, and we think in part because they're the happiest go lucky group. They feel great about what's going on for whatever reason, and they want to get out. So if you begin to break out leisure trips for next year by these three demos, and I'm leaving matures out for a minute, and I'll come back to that, you see that millennials is really the only one that's net positive going forward. Right? Xers and boomers are pretty much flat. This is the bad news about millennials. They are not loyal. And they're not loyal for a number of reasons I'm going to talk about, but I think the most important reason they're not loyal is they're young and inexperienced. They haven't created brand loyalty yet because they haven't experienced enough brands to decide which ones they're most loyal to. But they're flaky when it comes to travel, right? They're very unlikely to return to the same brands. They want to try different brands. It's also a misconception that boomers are more frequent travelers than millennials. Millennials actually travel more on a frequency basis, and they spend a lot. Now remember, this is just household incomes of $50,000 or more. A lot of millennials right out of college, have maybe their first job, living with a friend, don't have household income of $50,000, so they wouldn't be scored in this study. But look at the difference between not only what they're spending currently, but what they plan to spend. After matures, millennials are the next biggest spend per trip, higher than Gen Xers and higher than boomers, which to me is remarkable, and they're growing at the fastest rate. Matures still spend the most. They have the most, and they spend the most time traveling. This is another graphic I wasn't sure about sharing, but I did it anyway. Three core audiences. Why do they travel at the end of the day? Millennials want to explore. They want to get out and see things. They play that back time and time again in our research and others' research. Boomers just want to relax. They're a little farther along in their careers. They see travel as a respite. But as I said earlier, we Gen Xers are pessimists, and we want to get out and escape what we're doing every day because we may not be all that happy doing what we're doing every day. This is the way I interpret the research. It's certainly not true of everybody. But understanding this is really important because it plays into how you market to these groups differently. You know, I want to escape to enjoy a vacation is far different than I want to relax. It can be very different, and certainly it's different than explore. And just one thing about matures, because a lot of the boomers are going to be matures in the next 10 years. It is going to grow substantially, over 1 billion people over the age of 60 in the world by 2023. And an aging, growing community that is more active than ever before, that has more money than ever before, and who we view, you saw earlier, matures is only 6% of the market right now in terms of core travel. We see that doubling and maybe even tripling over the next 10 years. So we should not be so focused on millennials in this community that we forget about these boomers who are becoming matures and who are going to want to continue to travel. It's also important to understand how these different audiences travel. So solo travel. Millennials are the largest group that does travel on their own. We actually see a growth of tour operators who are catering just to single millennials who want to go by themselves on a trip and meet other people. You can assume, and this is pretty intuitive too, that Gen Xers are the largest segment of family travel. And then boomers do the most partner travel. The biggest part of boomers' community is that they travel with a partner, a group of friends, etc. Anybody want to guess who seeks kind of who wants to do this multi-generational travel? Who's seeking that at the greatest rate? It's boomers and matures because they want to bring grandparents and or grandkids and kids along. But the second largest group looking for multi-generational travel is millennials. Millennials want to connect with their parents or their grandparents, and they're actually seeking out multi-generational vacations, which was pretty surprising to me when I saw it. I don't know if it's surprising to you or not. So let's talk about some other things. Millennials are all about acquiring experiences. They want to collect in their toolkit these things they got to do that they can talk about. Eating different foods, meeting different people, experiencing different cultures. It's a very immersive type of trip that they want to do. They want to have experiences that are off the beaten path and different than they typically would do at home, or that typically would be different than other people want to do when they travel. That's a core part of the way millennials think about their travel experience. Boomers, however, play it safe. They return to the same destinations. They typically stay in the same hotel or brand-type hotels. They want to go to a branded experience that they can expect what they're going to do and that there's not a lot of serendipity. And in fact, if you think about this, it's maybe not that surprising to you, but boomers think about a trip to a museum in an urban city as adventurous. A millennial thinks about climbing a cliff in Hawaii as an adventurous experience. It's a totally different mindset. Surprisingly, millennials are willing to pay more for these experiences, and they have less income by and large. You saw the number I put up earlier that millennials are spending more. That's because they want to have quality experiences and they're willing to pay for it. Whereas boomers are the biggest value seekers in the market. This group of people, boomers, are the ones that are driving websites like Cheapo Air, Cheap Caribbean, the discounters like Hotel Tonight, Priceline. Boomers are the ones driving that because they're first and foremost a value seeker. They want a good deal first. Think about it this way. Millennials say, I want to do this. How much is it going to cost? Okay, I'll budget for it. Boomers say, I've got this budget. What can I do for it? That's the difference. Millennials, I've said this to this group before, I think, but millennials use travel agents at a higher rate than anybody else. Why? They're the least experienced. They need help. They want to talk to somebody. They want to go to far-flung places they've never been before, so they can't necessarily rely on traditional means to get there. They had 3 trips on average in a year through a bricks-and-mortar travel agent. I'm discounting OTAs or any kind of online travel agency. This is bricks-and-mortar agents. Boomers take care of it themselves. They've lived longer. They typically go back to the same places. They're experienced in those places. They don't need a lot of help from third parties. So they'll book direct with a hotel, or they'll rely on third-party sources that are online where they can sort of curate the experience. Totally different. Millennials are less conventional. They're 4 times more likely to extend a business trip into a leisure trip than any other segment. They'll take the train or other kinds of non-traditional transportation. Where do you think all these startups are coming from? Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, Relay Rides, Airlink, Windoo, all these crowdsourcing, shared sourcing brands are coming up because of not just millennials, but millennials are willing to do these kinds of things when they travel. They're willing to stay on a couch of someone they've never met before except online. I wouldn't do that in a million years, right? That's a common behavior for young travelers, and actually increasingly a behavior for even older travelers now. There's a lot of controversy about UberX and Lyft and this whole ride-sharing concept, and millennials are totally comfortable with it. They're totally comfortable getting in a car with someone they don't know because they've checked them out online and they have confidence in those online sources being legitimate. This sort of re-emphasizes the point about boomers being cheap, but I've reframed it as frugal, right? So what about Gen Xers? And this is the point I made at the outset. 28% of Gen Xers don't define themselves with a generational label. They either don't know that they're in that label or they don't think of it that way. And this comes back to the point at the beginning. If you're hitting millennials and the younger part of Gen Xers, and you're hitting boomers and the older part of Gen Xers, you're probably appealing to Gen Xers. And that's the bowling analogy, not the lima bean and Pac-Man analogy. So here's some generalities about travelers. 1, Gen X travelers are a very valuable market, right? And I think I've made that clear. You've got to be focused in your marketing efforts when you think about the spectrum of travelers, and make sure you're tweaking your message to who that audience is. Who is your core customer? Understanding value is still a major important factor for people who travel, but it's not always the only factor, and in some generations, it's not that big of a factor. And then based on who your core demos are, your marketing communication needs to be catered to some of the things I just shared with you. The mindset of the traveler, how they're thinking about that travel experience, not only from a pricing standpoint, but just from an experiential standpoint. Okay, how about some marketing considerations? For years, we've been hearing about mobile, and I'm here to tell you today that mobile is a reality. If you look at everything being raised in terms of capital on Wall Street, if you look at everybody in the travel startup business, if you look at even the big legacy travel brands, everybody's pivoted to mobile very quickly. It is where we need to be. We're at an inflection point in terms of desktop versus mobile. And when I say mobile, tablet, smartphone, we're about to pass the desktop use in terms of mobile. So what Tam said earlier about having a responsive website, or maybe Laura said it, a responsive website, you have to be mobile. You have to drive mobile content from your website. You have to think about a different frame and a different lens by which people are looking at content, right? You have to think about the way in which you serve up email so that they're mobile responsive. People want to do things on devices other than their desktop, and that's going to continue to happen at a greater rate. 39% of people who travel now have a laptop, a tablet, and a smartphone with them when they travel. So over a third have 3 devices with them when they travel. 14% have 4 with them when they travel. You know what the 4th one is? E-reader. 8% have 5 devices when they travel. What's the 5th device? Gaming console. Some kind of gaming console. People are carrying a lot of technology around, right? At some point, it's going to come together. And my bet is it's going to come together in some kind of screen size that it's nothing like a desktop experience. So you have to be thinking about that content and how you want to serve it up. How about sources for travel decisions? Tam talked a little bit about the progression this morning, and we have to be in all those channels and be thinking about the role in which, for example, for us, the website plays for you for the beaches of Fort Myers and Sanibel, but even for you, how do people use different channels of content for making travel decisions? Across the top is sort of the process they go through. They're inspired or they come up with initial ideas. They then look for advice or want to rate some of those ideas that they've come up with. They then begin to compare promotional, price, feature, and then ultimately they make the reservation. Now there's Beyond that, they then prepare to travel, they go travel, and then they return from travel. But in terms of getting that initial information, those 4 pieces, you can see that sources of information changes based on where they are in that process. Destination websites have a big role to play in a number of these channels. OTAs have an important role to play in all these channels. Advertising, content, but it's different based on where your traveler is. We're having a big argument with a client right now who, major player in the travel space, wants to start spending more money at the brand level when they're really just a transaction brand. They want to go up funnel and start doing things at the top of the decision-making process. Where do I want to go? When they're really just a transaction player. They're really just trying to get that last click so they can get the booking. So based on the kind of travel experience you or product you are, you have to think about where you're playing in this process and what marketing tools you use based on when you're trying to attract your guest or your visitor, your customer. But you can see it changes across those decisions. And then you think about suppliers and OTAs. 3 years ago, OTAs would have been above travel service websites in the making reservations process. OTAs were actually driving more reservations than were the actual brand suppliers. That's flipped just recently because suppliers have gotten control of their inventory. They're doing a better job from a marketing standpoint. But OTAs will always be here to stay because they have $100 million plus marketing budgets. We expect another consolidation very soon. We think that we will be left with 2 major OTAs inside the next 36 months, Priceline and Expedia. Already, Travelocity and Expedia have come together in some ways. We think there'll be more consolidation still to come, and we'll be left with 2 major OTAs who will be spending $400-500 million a piece annually to market to our customers. So then think about the market itself and going from broader, how we propagate our message, to more specific markets, one-on-one markets, and how we think about our customers. This is about data segmentation. This is about understanding who our customer is and what our brand is and connecting the two, right? So we certainly want to do brand awareness and marketing, but at the same time, we want to be able to guide a specific message to a specific person for a specific type of travel occasion. That could be using Facebook custom audiences to define something in Facebook that appeals to a specific audience. It could be sending direct mail or email, but it's getting more to one-on-one communication in a larger group, so it feels custom and it feels specific to who you are and who your customer is. This is how people share and consume travel information today. The reason I put this up is a lot of people forget that still, by and large, predominantly, people share information in conversation. In person or on the phone, by far the 2 highest indexing. So yes, social is a huge part of how people share information. Yes, email, instant messaging, texting, etc. But it's still personal conversations. The reason this is important is because it comes back to narrative and content. How am I creating a story that allows my customers to talk about it with their friends, whether it be in person or through any of these other means? Thinking about that through the context of all these different ways in which information is shared. And then you talk about the way people are consuming media today. This is a look at each of the demographic sets: television, radio, print, and web. And you can see web with millennials and Gen Xers is now outpacing even television and still lagging a little bit with boomers and matures. But also, a lot of traditional TV and film content's now being consumed online, right? So thinking about all the hours people spend in these different media informs that you have to have a multi-channel strategy. It's not one or not, and not another. It's all of them. How many hours a week do people spend on Facebook? Anybody know? 2 hours on average across the entire population people spend on Facebook. That's still a huge area of web consumption. Laura, Pamela maybe, talked about the number of sites people visit now before they actually book. The reason I put this up is because I think it's interesting to look at it through the lens of how recently they look at those sites. You can see 5 weeks out, they're on average looking at 2.5 sites. But once they get to week of booking, now they're really going, right? Now they're getting very active in pricing and price comparison and promotion shopping. So, early on, they're just idea, inspiration, but as they get closer to booking, they're actually spending a lot more time online and thinking about the actual booking. Anybody want to propose an answer to this question? It's a trick question. It's actually TripAdvisor. And the reason I put this up is because people like to think about TripAdvisor as a peer review site, right? That's how they were born. That's how they became a multi-billion-dollar company. But they're actually the largest meta-search brand in travel now. They've just introduced a booking widget. I think it's called Trip Now or Travel Now, and they actually are allowing people to book direct to suppliers through TripAdvisor. So not only is it important to play with TripAdvisor in terms of reviews, but you have to understand that it's the number one influencer of hotel accommodations now through the way in which people search inside of TripAdvisor. So it all comes back to content. Bill Gates said this almost 20 years ago, that he who owns the content will win, right? So that leads into this point. I think it was 10 years ago or so we polled people and they said, look, I go on vacation, I want to get away from technology. I'm getting away from my job. It's this whole escape thing, right? I want to leave that behind and go relax. We now find out that people cannot relax unless they're wired in. It's such a pervasive part of the way we live now. When we go on vacation, we have to be tied in or we get stressed out. Which is pretty interesting. 62% of people go online for no particular reason, right? So this whole content matrix, right? All the things we're doing as marketers that drive a message centrally, our message and our content. That's the way you should be thinking as marketers. All the disparate ways in which you propagate your story have to come together in one unified way or you're not going to win. And social's a big part of that. 1/4 of people say that they post photos on their Facebook for travel just to make their friends jealous. Millennials lead the pack in that respect, right? And people also want to capture the experiences they're having. I'd argue that the second point is part of the first point, but it's a huge part of the travel experience now is to share it online in whatever way you are, and that's a huge marketing opportunity to be in the middle of that conversation, either paid or organically. So one of the things I've said to this group before, I will say it again today, social used to be very much an organic media. As a marketer, you could get in the middle of conversation simply by posting content. Somebody on Facebook's talking about a resort, you could get online and engage them. Well, all the social players now are pushing that organic content out and they're making you pay for it, which is good in some ways because you can now target your message more specifically to audiences that you want to target in specific content areas you want to target, but it's becoming more expensive. And if you're not investing in paid social, you should be looking at it because it's a very good way to target customers or potential customers. Another thing I wanted to point out today was how big YouTube's become for short-form content. YouTube's becoming a search engine of its own. People are doing wide berth searches on YouTube to pull back video of whatever they want to learn about, even to a higher degree than Facebook in terms of content. So thinking about what you're doing with a YouTube channel, thinking about how you're creating original content via video and sharing that out. Some of what the MMGY and the VC Beat staff have been working on in terms of content you saw this morning. That is really important to build and share at whatever budget level you can afford to do it. Okay, so I'll wrap it up. I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome. 4 things to consider. Audiences are varied and they're nuanced. Don't buy into assumptions about that. Make sure your content's consistent, that you create offer designs that make sense, that narrative extends across every channel of marketing that you can affect. Don't buy into the assumptions about travel behavior. While I've shared some of them with you today, as I pointed out a second ago, they're nuanced. And you have to understand what your brand relationship is to those audiences. Some people are far different in the eyes of a mature than others are. Where does your brand play in that conversation and how you're leveraging it? And then all the different resources I shared with you earlier in terms of how you grow awareness and how you drive a message that are intrinsic to the way your customer plans and books. Got to be able to think about that. Okay? So I always like to end my presentations with a test to see if you were paying attention, right? Let's see if you can get this awareness test. I can get it started here.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
Count them out.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So the moonwalking bear was really there the first time you saw that video, right? So it comes back to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's quote about sometimes facts can be deceiving, right? You were so focused on counting those passes, right, that you didn't see the bear coming right through the middle of the screen. I think that's brilliant, by the way. We didn't do that. It was done by somebody in the UK. I just think it's brilliant. And it's a good example of how sometimes things right in front of your face you don't see for yourselves, right? That's my presentation. I would be glad to take any questions. We often post some of our research to my Twitter feed, which you're welcome to jot down. But I'd love to hear questions if you have some. I could try to provide some more specifics. None? That's okay too. I'm glad I answered all your questions. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.